Hello, and welcome to Lecture 10 of our class. Today, I want to deal with the issue of, in a sense, asking the question, what models should we use when we study the spread and the development of Buddhism in the Great Circle? And there are many possibilities. I think we should explore them. So today we'll explore a couple. And I hope that all of you who are taking this course will turn your attention to what kind of model you would like to try and look at. So let's start. Here's a map of China, and the dark areas are those areas that have the highest percentage of Buddhists. And we see two very distinct areas. One, of course, is Tibet and the Qinghai Plateau, and the other is the eastern seaboard of China. So here we understand that within the confines of the current nation state of China, we have two very different kinds, if you will, of dissemination of Buddhism. So how can we study this? What's our model for trying to find out how did we arrive at this place? Now, if we look at the eastern seaboard of China and we see the provinces, we can understand that there are basically four places where the percentage of Buddhists is quite high. And that includes Taiwan and two of the coastal provinces, as you will see, and one adjoining province, which is farther inland. So the question is, how do we study these two particular types of the appearance of Buddhism in the contemporary world? In other words, this is a picture of the present time. How did it come to be? How can we explain it? What's its history? What happened to bring this about? We've already discussed that there were great Buddhist centers. There were great Buddhist centers, and these were spread across the subcontinent, across mainland Southeast Asia and island Southeast Asia into China, which has its own monuments. Bengal, the Bay of Bengal, the province of Bengal, the current nation state of Bangladesh, were the sites of many of these great centers. And it's from these centers that we can begin to look at the inner Asia development of Buddhism. When you look at the map, you'll see that the great rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come together at that confluence in the delta of the Bay of Bengal. A lot of water. The people in Bangladesh understand that. Each year they get enormous floods, And the story of how Buddhism could spread from here is part of how we can explain those dark areas in Western China or Tibet and the Qinghai Plateau. You know, I think the thing which surprises me still is trying to travel around the Himalayas. There just aren't any roads, or very few. It's very difficult. And that's not just modern. That was from the time when the Buddhist tradition was trying to spread from this Bay of Bengal north. The route it took should be no real secret to us. There just aren't many ways to get there. And we have to follow and look at the Bay of Bengal and the roads that currently exist and understand just how really difficult it is for there to be travel in areas like this. So Inner Asia, and of course, Inner Asia is both China and Mongolia, as well as parts of Eastern Russia, plus the stands. So we can see from this map that the two parts of the cultural features of Tibet, the Qinghai Plateau, the Mongol part of this Inner Asia spread, which is Mongolia, which spreads across into what's now Eastern Russia. And this form received its Buddhism primarily from the Bay of Bengal centers, those great, huge Buddhist university monastic structures that are still standing that tell us of a time when there were thousands of monastics living together. And these monastics who lived together formed a complex and interactive way of describing and dealing with the Buddhist experience that's been preserved in remarkable manner by the Tibetans and by their satellite tradition in Mongolia. When I said it was hard to get there, this is a real road. This is a major road from India to Lhasa. And this has been carved out in more recent times. It's still terrifying to take a bus along such roads, whereas you sit up high and look out the window, you're looking down what looks like miles to a drop of altitude, which is, as I say, very frightening. Crossing the Himalayas was so difficult. And there were only a few places where it could occur. Now, the so-called Silk Road made another decision. There we looked not at the Ganges so much or the Brahmaputra rivers, but we looked to the Indus. And they followed the Indus Valley and drainage area around the Himalayan Western developments, and then crossed at a lower altitude into the Tarim Basin and from there into China. So I'm showing you some of these because it's real. For example, the modern roads from the Bay of Bengal to enter Asia, not many still. And when you go on those roads, there are long distances where there's nothing in terms of development or population centers. They are just strategic avenues to connect population areas for trade, travel, communication. So the spread of Buddhism north was through this very difficult terrain. And in many ways, the best way to do it is just to walk it. And that's exactly what a lot of people did. It's much easier to cross the passes on foot than to try to find in the past some kind of animal to ride over such high altitude. So I'm just indicating to you that the way in which I'm looking for models to study, how did Buddhism spread from the Bay of Bengal into Inner Asia? And do it so successfully that even today, when we study the map of China, there it is. It's still there. It has made an enormous impact on the culture and the life of Inner Asia. Even today, to get from China into Tibet, the Sichuan to Tibet highway, you can see it has to double back and cross itself, and you make a long journey, and you can look back and see that you've just been climbing. You haven't been traveling so much as climbing up the mountain, and then you have to, of course, go down the other side. So the spread of Buddhism into Inner Asia is very romantic. It's beautiful. You need to do it when you're younger. I did a lot of this travel when I was in my 40s, 50 years ago. I look back and I'm glad I did it when I did, but I know, I understand, because of having walked part of this, how difficult it was for those monastics who left the Bay of Bengal, particularly when the Islamic invasion came and monasteries were being destroyed by these invading armies. The monks had to flee on foot, and most of them walked to Tibet, to Nepal, and from there to Tibet. So the question is, how do you study the form of Buddhism which was carried literally on the backs of monastics as they walked across the mountain passes into Tibet? I have to tell you that I'm not at all convinced that we know how to study Tibetan Buddhism still. I'm not sure that we have a good model for how to study the intricacies of the tantric tradition, which is filled with hundreds of deities, and the relationship between those deities, the stories, the ideas, the dharanies, the chanting, the spells. We're doing I mean, not myself so much as the Tibetan scholars, that is those people who study the Tibetan tradition, doing a very admirable and wonderful job. I don't intend any of this for criticism of it. It is made great advances. I'm just saying, I don't think that we yet have all the models for how to study it. Why all these deities? What led to the creation of such a pantheon? It seems to me that the powerful part of the form of Buddhism, which went into Inner Asia, was that the Buddhist practitioners were able to identify aspects of experience, the mind, if you will, the powers that are present in our mental process. And having identified these powers, they personified them. And it's the personification of the power of that are uncovered in deep trance meditation, which is the way in which this form of Buddhism was transmitted to the public, to the practitioners, that by personification, you have all sorts of ways. It's a great model. If you can personify the power, then you can tell stories about origin, development, the aspects of the power that can be directed here and there. You give it agency. It was and is one of the great religious traditions. And I think we still need to consider how we're going to study it. And it was this tradition which marked that Inner Asia part of Buddhism still in today's world in China. Now, we saw that the other aspect of Buddhism was found in the coastal regions. And the Buddhist tradition, which spread, and we're going to talk about this later, spread across Southeast Asia. We need to have a model for that, as well as a model for the study of it into Inner Asia. And those models are still being developed, in my view. The Buddhism which flowed along the highland Southeast Asia, and I believe that the model which works pretty well is to say that you can study this spread, number one, as island Southeast Asia. That's Sumatra and the whole Indonesian archipelago, or you can study it as the mainland Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. So we now are looking at how Buddhism moved to the East. The center of Buddhism remained its old homeland, the Gangetic Basin. The final form of Buddhism that developed in India came from that region under the aegis of the Pala dynasty, which covered the old Buddhist homeland. And how that spread north and how it spread to the east constitutes the study of the great circle of Buddhism. one of the most important parts of island Southeast Asia is to understand Palembang. Palembang was the place where Indian ideas really came in contact with Chinese and East Asian ones. And it played such an active role as the stopping off place where people went to prepare themselves to go to India from China, where pilgrims went to learn Sanskrit so that when they got to India, they would have something they would be able to speak, they would be able to study. So Palembang is very important, but as we've mentioned before, the problem is there's almost nothing left of what it was like. It seems to have been a city built mainly from wood, on stilts, in a river basin to keep away from the floods. So consequently, we don't have, as we do in the Bay of Bengal, those enormous structures still left standing, made of brick and stone. So the Buddhism which spread across to the east headed for Guangzhou. And Guangzhou is the southern portal for Chinese Buddhism. Just recently, I noticed that one Chinese scholar said, you cannot study Buddhism from the maritime perspective, that he's looked at it and he couldn't find anything of value. I'm not sure exactly what he's studying, because the form of Buddhism which you find in China today didn't come on the Silk Road, wasn't northern. So a scholar sitting in Beijing and saying it must have come through here, or it's not worth even considering, it came through Chang'an. I just can't agree with it, because the portal at Guangzhou brought in so much that we see today. Bodhidharma came that way. Yogacara came that way. Guanyin had her major development as Avalokiteshvara, the goddess of the sea. All of these are what you find if you look at Chinese Buddhism. It's Chan meditation, it's mind-only school of philosophy, and it is Guanyin practice. In many ways, Buddhism in China is a Guanyin cult. Guanyin occupies much more time of people, I think, than Shakyamuni Buddha. Guanyin is a key and a very important part of the way in which Chinese Buddhism developed. So let's go back and think. Southeast Asia, mainland. You look at the map. Mainland Southeast Asia is like a physical barrier to the travel from India toward the Pacific Ocean. Just as India itself, the subcontinent, is a barrier to the travel from the Mediterranean, Red Sea, across to the Pacific Ocean. And these two great land masses that extend southward into the Indian Ocean are the geographic areas that have to be studied and understood in terms of how Buddhism made its way into China. When you turn to mainland, I want to suggest a new model. I want to suggest riverine Buddhism. I believe that just as we study the Silk Road, which is the Buddhism that spread along a particular part of the trade route from the western seaports of India to Chang'an in the Han Dynasty, that we need to study the maritime ports that went across Southeast Asia, up the coast of China, to Korea, and to Japan. But at the same time, I think we really need a model for studying riverine Buddhism, particularly as we deal with mainland Southeast Asia. Now, we've talked about the Indus. That was leading from the west coast of India into Inner Asia, formed the rim of the great circle of Buddhism at one time. In the east, the great rivers, the Ganges, of course, the homeland of Buddhism. Buddhism arose along the banks of the Ganges in the rainforest that existed. There was also the Brahmaputra, as we've said. Brahmaputra is an enormous river which flows around the Himalayas and down into the Bay of Bengal. There's also, as you come across mainland Southeast Asia, for example, take Myanmar. To study Buddhism in Myanmar, you really have to study the Irrawaddy River. You've got to study the embankments of the Irrawaddy as Buddhism made its way up into mainland Southeast Asia. It's a wonderful trip, although hot and not always so comfortable, to take, in the old days, a paddle steamer, which took you up the Irrawaddy all the way to Mandalay. And as you go along, there are these enormous Buddhist sites. The same thing when you go over to the next over into Thailand. It's the Chao Phraya River, which leads up through Bangkok, Ayutthaya, as it's in its drainage areas. The fact that these two rivers so dominated those regions had an enormous influence on the way in which Buddhism developed there. In other words, the Buddhism you find along the Irrawaddy and the Buddhism you find along the Chao Phraya are not necessarily identical. The Buddhism you find moving up the Indus into Inner Asia compared to the Buddhism you find moving up from the Ganges through the Brahmaputra River into Inner Asia, all have their particular characteristics. So that's why I'm suggesting that one model for study of Buddhism should be riverine. When we move next over to Cambodia, Angkor Wat, which is to the far north, basically, is in fact reachable by water. It's a very long, hot day to get on the boat and come down from Angkor Wat through the lakes, the rivers, the canals, until you reach the sea. But much of the development of Buddhism that you find in that region, the remains of it and the archaeological sites that line this waterway need to be studied quite seriously. Angkor Wat needs to be understood. Of course, that it had some road trade, of course, and it was a land-based place. But I think the real driving force for Angkor Wat was that it was part of riverine Buddhism. And we should take that into our model for the study of Angkor Wat, and also to try to understand how it developed, how it became such a really big place, one of the world's largest cities at one time. And we need to understand that the Buddhist traditions of these regions are in many ways spelled out by these rivers. For example, the Red River and the Mekong. The Red River had early development in the region of what's now Hanoi. And Red River Buddhism is one of the first places where we began to find in East Asia aspects of Buddhism which would later wind up and move into Guangzhou. Guangzhou, of course, is itself on the Pearl River. Hong Kong, as it now has been developed, was not in the past. There was nothing really there during the time when Buddhism was sweeping up the Pearl River to Guangzhou. It was Guangzhou that was the port. Hong Kong is a part of global Buddhism, the colonial system. It was developed as a strategic spot, as was Macau, tied to what was going on with the colonial system as it spread. So when we study all of these places, you'll see it's been one river after another. And as we move into China, you can hardly study the Buddhist tradition without looking carefully at the Yangtze, the so-called Yellow River, both of them draining large portions of the Chinese landscape. And then China added another thing that we have to work with. They added an artificial river. They made the Grand Canal hundreds of miles long, inland. So you didn't have to go to the sea. You could stay on the water and go all the way from the north to the south in China. We know that the Grand Canal had many Buddhist temples built along it. Most of them have been destroyed, so we don't have the actual place, as one of the scholars remarked. The Grand Canal is like, as you go along, you'll see gaps, like a missing tooth. And the gaps in the housing where a monastery, a temple once existed, that's gone. So we have to study, I think, the way in which Buddhism spread so that the modern day Buddhism in China spread right up the Yangtze, spread up the Yellow. The Silk Road, after all, went into the Yellow River Basin. And then the Grand Canal connecting the north. So what I've been saying today is when you look at this map and you see where the percentage of Buddhists are today in China, we need to understand a model for understanding why Buddhism is still so strong in these places. How did it get there? This is all within the great circle of Buddhism. And as we study the way it got there, at least one of the models which I'm suggesting we should turn to is the model for riverine Buddhism. If you're going to study riverine Buddhism, you also have to understand that the riverine aspect requires us to understand that rivers have two embankments. And the culture on one side of a big river and the culture on the other embankment may be quite different. The Indus, the western bank and the eastern bank of the Indus as you go up into the mountains, the significance of where the Buddhist developments were. They were on the western embankment because you had to get out of the mountains. You had to get across the rivers in order for the Buddhism to spread the way it did. So take this map, look at it. I've been painting with very broad strokes today. And see what you can make of dealing with the Buddhism that spread from India across mainland Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, through Guangzhou, through the other ports of Eastern China, and still influence and remain a part of the culture today. So thank you very much.